first speaker is a gifted youth who triumphed over the 3 Ds: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD. He still became an award-winning entrepreneur. He is an inventor, a technology columnist, and will today reveal the science behind smartphone addiction and offers also a technological solution. The serial entrepreneur has founded many startups, is part of many projects, including his latest venture, Smartklock. He won the Startup at Singapore Award, the first national technopreneurship competition in Singapore. He also has to his credit the Best Business Plan Award from Sybase Singapore in the Global Entrepreneurs Challenge at Stanford University, California. Ladies and gentlemen, in the IT circles in Goa, he's known as our very own Tony Stark. Please put your hands together to welcome to the stage Jason the Iron Man Fernandes.
Okay, have y'all ever been just about ready to sleep and you hear that noise? You try to turn it off, you try to ignore it, but then it rings again and you're disturbed. And now you just have to see what it is. And now you're wondering, who is it? Is it important? Now the little light blinks green and you think, well, most of y'all know that the light blinking green means that you got a WhatsApp message, but who is it from? And is it important? So now you wonder, did you know that the average person checks their phone once every 6.5 minutes? So to put that in perspective, that's 150 times a day. It's a wonder how anybody is able to get anything done these days. Especially since statistics say it takes up to 23 minutes to get back to what you were doing. Now, latest research out of the University of British Columbia says that smartphone use can trigger ADHD. Now, it doesn't say that smartphone use causes ADHD. It just says that it triggers ADHD-like symptoms in normal people. So now you might be wondering, what's the link? First of all, ADHD is a neurological condition that renders people impulsive, hyperactive, and with trouble focusing. It affects about 10% of the population. So you may be wondering what the link is between these two things. The link between smartphone addiction and ADHD is dopamine. So dopamine is like a pleasure transmitter. Essentially, when something good happens to you, when you get a message, something nice happens, it basically sends you a little pleasure right into your brain. So in the case of a smartphone addict, when they get a message from somebody they like, or WhatsApp, or Facebook, that results in a little spike of dopamine. So multiple spikes of dopamine during the day can lead to the dependence of dopamine, and that leads to smartphone addiction. So the root cause of smartphone addiction is basically elevated dopamine. With ADHD, it's thought to be related to basically low dopamine in ADHD people. That's what the relationship is. So ADHD medication, stimulants, the idea is to regulate your dopamine. So now why is it important to regulate dopamine? I want to get into ADHD, a life with dopamine regulation issues. So basically, being diagnosed, I have ADHD, right? So being diagnosed with ADHD is essentially like being sentenced to a lifetime of dopamine regulation issues. So I was completely unable to concentrate in school. I think in a word, if I were to describe myself as a student, I'd probably say it's terrible, a terrible student. And that actually might be an understatement. So I was completely unable to concentrate. And I also had other issues. So I was not able to read the way other people were. So all this was explained when I was diagnosed at 15 with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, followed shortly thereafter with ADHD. So you might say, as far as learning disabilities were concerned, I hit the jackpot. So when I was first diagnosed, my teachers expressed severe reservations about whether I would actually be able to pass my exams, given my issues. So when my parents decided to take me out of school, my school was pretty much only too happy to see me go. But this time I had something special, right? Now that I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was able to get medication for it. So the medication was able to regulate my dopamine. Unfortunately, it didn't have the effect that everybody expected. Rather than poring over my books and getting really good at that, I instead developed a fascination for UFOs. And the fascination for UFOs progressed into a full-blown obsession. So I spent hours upon days creating a program called the UFO story, and then lobbying to get it on Chip Magazine's Chip CD, which I successfully managed to. But of course, that wasn't quite what the medication was for. So this is the first article that they ever wrote about me. So all that thing basically got this first article from India Today. It's the first national magazine. So look at the title. It says, Web Junkies. It's a story about internet addicts, people with no social life, and people who live for the internet. So look at the caption underneath my name. It says, school dropout Jason Fernandes feels he'll be the next Bill Gates. His obsession, aliens and the paranormal. I secretly believe that I'll become the next Bill Gates, he says. So this was obviously not right, because I never said secretly. But more importantly, I wasn't a school dropout. So you can just imagine what being called a school dropout and effectively delusional in a national magazine did to me. So my parents were not pleased, and it really crushed me. But because I now had this ADHD medication and I was able to regulate my dopamine, I was basically focused, while still being characteristically ADHD about focusing on any one thing, I was suddenly focused on my success. And it worked. So within the next 2 years, I was able to start basically several companies. I started a nonprofit, LD Kids. I won the ChildNet International Award. I met the president of Barbados and advised the education minister of Barbados as well. And I even managed to get on TV a few times. So let me get back here. So I was able to get on MTV, the Associated Press, and even Sky TV. So all this was like really excellent, right? So it looks like I've basically hit the big time, right? But boy, was I wrong. So I go to the US, and effectively I don't have access to my ADHD medication anymore. So what that left me with my dopamine unregulated. So I was completely unable to focus again. If you were to look in a dictionary, you'd probably find my picture under unfocused. So I was on scholastic probation, and they even tried to dismiss me, but I managed to get off on a technicality. Soon, I was broke, because basically my parents, since I was still in school, and since I was failing classes, my projected graduation date had stretched past the ability where my parents were still able to fund my education. So they asked me to come back, and I said no. I said I'd figure out something, but I didn't really have a plan. So very soon I was broke, evicted from my apartment, and effectively homeless. So this is basically the street that I used to hang out on at that time. So then something magical happened, right? I somehow managed to get my medication again, and the dopamine regulation caused a turnaround. So within a few years, not only did I get off academic probation, but I was able to graduate. My final semester GPA was a 4.0. I also managed to get an international patent for the system for recording TV, essentially. The world's first internet-based DVR. And finally, speaking of inventions, Apple invented the iPhone. And I went out and bought it as soon as possible. And this is basically my introduction to notifications. So now, cut to 2017, just a decade later, iPhone is in its 7th generation. Smartphones have saturated the market, and notifications have taken over. There's even a word for it, nomophobia. This is a word for smartphone addiction. And the reason is, again, it's our old friend dopamine that's responsible. So I got really curious about this, particularly because of my own struggles with ADHD, which I just detailed, and the fact that there's a relationship between smartphones and ADHD. I tried to think about, is there possibly a technological solution, particularly with my background in technology. So I did a lot of research, and I found out, essentially, notifications are designed to get you hooked. Because marketers use something known as the hook model, right? So chief among the hook model, the main component is something known as a variable scheduled rewards. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's assume you have $1, right? And you have a vending machine, and every time you put in $1, you get a Coke. So you'll use it, but you won't get addicted. Now let's change it up a bit. Let's assume every time you put in $1, you may get a Coke. Now you introduce a little bit of chance, and now there's a high possibility for addiction. So the same is true for notifications. When you get a message and you don't know what it is, it creates a compulsion to check, because now you just have to know. So what's the solution to this, right? The solution is basically two things. One is you filter notifications, and two is you stagger them. What do I mean by that? So filter, first thing is you turn off some notifications altogether for certain apps. The ones that you really need, you have to go in there and really dial in your settings so that you only get notified of the things that you want. So basically, because it's a useless information that gets you addicted, the less useless information equals to less chances of being addicted. Because the useless notifications that you get, while they may seem useless to you, they're extremely useful to the company because they help get you addicted. So the more time you spend with this, even though it's manual and it takes a lot of time, the better it is for you. The next thing is to stagger, right? So you want to start checking your notifications. You want to increase the intervals between which you check your notifications. So if you're going to check them, like if you were checking them every 5 minutes, you move to 10, and then slowly 30, and then slowly 40. The problem is, push notifications are great, right? But they come as soon as you get them. You can't really change that push notification to pull notification. So, and sometimes that's what you need to do. So the best way to get around this is basically just put your phone face down. Now, this would be the ideal solution, right? But the problem is to filter messages, I have to go through each app settings individually. There's not a unified platform where you can change your settings for your notifications across apps, across different platforms. It just doesn't exist. The other problem is, if I were to stagger my notifications and keep my phone face down, I might miss important notifications. So that's what the genesis of this company we founded, Smartklock. And essentially, what we do is, we have a cloud-based server, and we essentially filter our notifications. It comes into the cloud, and we filter them, and then it finally gets into your device. Now, this isn't a ADHD tool. It's essentially a productivity tool, but it has a side benefit. It's basically for anybody who wants to track multiple pieces of data, whether that's stocks, currency, or basically even news. But it works as a really, really, really good solution for smartphone addiction. So the early response has been tremendous. So we were covered by the Times, also by the Herald, and we even received a note from Steve Wozniak and also Arianna Huffington. Smartklock is coming soon to Kickstarter. So the reason I mention this is because the theme for this TEDx conference is The Answers Within. And so you may be wondering, what do we do right now? Smartklock's not out. What do we do in the meantime? Could it be possible that when it comes to notifications as well, that the answers are also within? And I think so, yes. The one way to do it is you can unhook yourself using the variable reward system for good. Now, what do I mean by that? There's a student called Alan Rees who's come up with this thing called habit judo, which essentially has 3 steps. The first step involves choosing a random number from 1 to 10. And every time you perform a desired behavior, you basically give yourself that many points. The second step is to accumulate these points at random. And once you hit a certain threshold, which is step 3, you reward yourself. So what this does is it allows you to use the variable reward system for good and allows you to use it for positive reinforcement as opposed to getting addicted to something. So the idea is if you're going to get addicted to things, you can do it to where you're getting addicted to unhooking yourself, right? Because if you use these steps properly and you choose a random number, then you accumulate points and you reward yourself, you can link the variable reward system that you were using to good. So finally, it's really important that we take care of notifications right now because this problem is not going away anytime soon. The average person receives 60 notifications a day, and that number will only increase as the phone has more memory and more apps get installed, each one of those apps vying for your attention. So if you're going to take care of anything, take care of it now. Now is the time to solve it because eventually there's just going to be more notifications. So if you're going to get hooked on anything, get hooked on getting unhooked from notifications. And enjoy the rest of your life. Thank you.